folks, welcome back to another episode of the Retail Perch Show. It took a little hiatus there, a couple of weeks in between. Got really busy with our lives there, Gary, right?
Yes, we did, and it's hard to believe that summer is almost over here.
I know. It's the first of, well, we're recording this very close to the end of August, so you're probably going to hear it by the time it's September. But it's been a fantastic summer, been busy, lots of interesting things happening around the world. But today, we're really excited to meet a one-of-a-kind guest on the Retail Perch. Now, Gary, we've spoken to technologists, we've spoken to brands, retailers, analysts, PR people, all kinds of people. We've never spoken to an inventor so far, I
That's
believe.
right. That's right. And especially a technology that is so pervasive and embedded in the retail industry.
Yeah, and a technology that you don't even think somebody invented. You feel like it's always been there because it's such an integral part of our life. It's on everything that I buy from, no matter which retailer I go to. This thing has got Paul's imprint on it. So our guest today is Paul McEnroe, and one day maybe we'll also get John McEnroe on the Retail Perch. But today we have Paul McEnroe. We will be talking about different things though. But I'm going to let Paul kind of give you his background and his story for the first 5 minutes, because I'm sure he's got such a long and illustrious background. Might take the whole episode to really introduce him properly, but for brevity's sake, we will get through that in the first 5 minutes. But Paul is the inventor of the ubiquitous barcode, and that's all I need to say about that. So, Paul, welcome to the Retail Perch.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure.
So, Paul, would love for our audience to kind of hear your background. Where'd you grow up? Your education experience, your industry experience, and how did you wind up inventing this amazing thing?
Yeah, sure. Well, I'd be happy to say a few words about that. So first of all, I started out in an orphanage in Michigan. Parents, coal miners from West Virginia, couldn't afford me. Was adopted a couple of years later by a loving family in Ohio. Grew up in Dayton, Ohio, in a modest setting, but my parents, adopting parents, weren't well educated. My father never went to school. My mother, I don't believe, graduated from high school, but they were very wonderful, kind people who hadn't had a child for their 20 years of marriage, so they adopted me. And they convinced me that education was a very important factor, and that was enough to get me going. And I went through all the school system in Dayton, Ohio, even up through college, which I worked my way through various jobs in newspapers. First of all, the paper route, and then full-time job at the newspaper company. And then finally went into the University of Dayton and got a degree, and went to graduate school and got another degree and started interviewing around. And my father had always told me wonderful stories about the West, because he had been adopted and had to run away from home to the West as well. And then he met my mother after he served in the First World War, and they were married in Idaho, but they moved back to Ohio. And so I always had this love of the West and of horses and that sort of thing. So that's kind of guided my social life. Anyway, I took a job at IBM in California and went to work there doing research and studying at Stanford at the same time on advanced degrees. And I fortunately I was assigned to do this advanced development in computer things that interfaced with mostly computers, either human interface to computers. And one of them was scanning, so I did a lot of scanning. That was most of what I did for those 9 years. And then in
So, Paul, what
1969.
background? So this is 1960s, is that right?
So I joined IBM in 1960. So 9 years later, 1969, a senior executive of IBM, later to become president of IBM, walked in my office and said, "Paul, we want you to change jobs and step aside and find a new business area for us to go into. And the background to that is that the president CEO of IBM at the time, Frank Carey, very famous person, had IBM was on a terrific growth curve. I forget what the percentage was, but it was phenomenal. And he said, the growth in computers is just not big enough for us to keep our growth curve going. So we got to get at least in the periphery of computers, some applications that we're not in yet. And that's the only way we're going to grow. So he asked his staff to go out and buy some companies in Silicon Valley. And they said, no, Frank, you don't understand. You're too isolated here. The people won't come with the companies. They'll quit the next morning. They don't want the blue suits, white shirts, red ties, black wingtips, and all that stuff that went with IBM. And so he said, okay, well, we got to do something. So they worked out an alternative, which was to go find somebody in IBM and paint an imaginary red line around them so that they could operate like a startup company instead of like a commercial IBM, which had all these rules and regulations that you'd never be able to start a company up under. And somehow they picked me out to be the engineering development manager of that, and another gentleman to head it up as the overall business manager.
So
but I had
did
just
this company have a
completed,
name? Did the subsidiary have a name?
Not yet, did not have a name. We named it. And the name we gave to it 6 months later was Consumer Transaction Systems. So CTS. So it stood for anything where there was a transaction with the consumer. So that was the name but it hadn't happened yet. So meanwhile, so then the guy that they had set me up to work for quit. He left the company because they wanted to do the project in North Carolina. We were in California, and he didn't want to move to North Carolina. And the reason IBM wanted to do a product in North Carolina was that factory was pretty empty, whereas the factory in California was full. Anyway, so then since I had just pretty much completed the equivalent of an MBA at Stanford, I think they just decided to, have me be the systems manager, doing business and marketing as well as the engineering. So I did that for a period of time. And I looked at different industries for us to start in. And like I said, they didn't want to go into something so different from computers like oil exploration or something like that, real estate. They wanted to do something where it touched computers, such as banking, or airline reservations or something like that. But I picked point of sale. The reason I picked point of sale, I mentioned I grew up in Dayton, Ohio, in the shadow of National Cash Register and CR, which had 95% of the business in point of sale from the 1880s. So, a long time. But you know what the product looked like? Great big iron cash register, hard to modify, no electronics in it to speak of, just electrical equipment with printers and cast iron and weighed it a lot, and so on, hard to change. And so I could see that the writings in the various rags of the industry that were going on at the time were talking about item identification. So we could see that was coming, and we thought we could really improve the operation of the supermarket. Then that happened more so and more so. So I put a proposal together in 1969, took it to the IBM executives, and they blessed it. And then in 1970, just the next year, but luckily for us, the Supermarket Institute, under the leadership of Alan Haberman, decided to form an ad hoc committee to select whatever that item identifier was going to be. And so they formed the committee in 1970. This was about a year after we had started. So we were already working on this. And they went through a selection process. They put out, they wisely realized that they didn't have the expertise, the supermarket executives themselves, to make all these technical decisions and so on and so forth. And so they hired McKinsey and Company consulting firm out of New York,
Right.
leading consulting firm of the day, to do that job for them. And so we and all the other manufacturers who were interested worked with them. There were 14 manufacturers working on the project
Wow. Hmm.
at the
It's all
time.
the big
Well,
ones, I'm
that's how
guessing.
many joined up. Uh, 7 were named finalists. And in my book, I do have a copy of the page out of Business Week for that, the week that it was selected in 1973. And our code was selected, basically.
Wow.
Actually, there's a little story, if you don't mind, a little story. The head
Yeah.
of the head of McKinsey walked out of the decision meeting that the Supermarket Institute ad hoc committee was making and said, Paul, he said, your code is by far, superior in every way to all the other codes. But the committee is thinking they can't select it because there'll be too much social reaction to us picking the code of Big Blue, the biggest company in the world, blah, blah,
Wow.
blah,
So you
all that
almost didn't
kind of
get
stuff.
picked. All right.
So he said, they're not going to pick you.
Oh my
And
God.
so I said, well, and this is in the book too. I said, you know what? Before I came out here, my staff uh, pointed out 2 improvements. Is actually a guy on my staff, George Lauer. He had 2 improvements that we had made after the deadline for making improvements. And so I didn't put them in. They were very minor, very minor. It didn't even change the scanner equipment or the logic to read it or anything.
Right.
Almost invisible to the eye. But anyway, they were slight improvements. I said, Larry, and was the guy from McKinsey. I'm going to give you these 2 improvements, and I'm not going to claim any right to them or title or anything else like that. And you guys can take them and call that your own code. And then you don't have to say that you picked IBM's code.
Oh,
And so, as a matter of fact, he came back out sometime later and told me, hey, I'm surprised, but they bought it. And so
wow.
you'll see if you read the Business Week article that it shows a picture of our code as proposed and a picture of the code they selected. And you can see it's virtually identical to the IBM code and very different from all the other codes that were submitted. But
Wow.
nevertheless, we won. I was a little worried I might get fired or something because I had no authority to do that. But I did want to correct one thing that you stated in the beginning about me inventing the code. First of all, I'd like to say that it was developed by a team effort, not an individual. It was something that took place over quite a long period of time, years. And also, there's no invention because we were told wisely by the Supermarket Institute. These people figured it out wisely that whoever submits a solution to this item identification thing that they had talked about should put it in the public domain so that nobody is going to become, the richest person in the world
Right.
for having, because with 10 billion a day, like you say, I mean, no matter how small an amount you get for every one, I mean, you'd be the richest person in the world. So they wanted to protect that. So we were all told, don't file any patents on this thing.
Oh,
So even the team didn't file a patent. Now we patented and everybody else patented the equipment that reads it and so on. Everybody can make their own equipment.
right.
And anybody that submitted a code had to agree to put a publication out that would help everybody else read the code and build equipment, their own equipment, and they
Hmm.
could patent that. So that's the way it worked. That's the way people made money. But nobody ever got rich off of any patent on the code. And as I say, I like to say that it was developed by a team. And the team I had that I formed in 1969, the first we had 6 guys that started on that team, and basically they were the ones that came up with the code.
Wow.
That is stunning. That's amazing. So when did it go into major adoption? Like, when was it actually?
Okay, so very good question. So in by 1973, by the time the code was selected, we had it working very well. As a matter of fact, in my book, for people who are technically oriented, I put an appendix, and the appendix is not something I wrote now. I couldn't even remember how to write it. The appendix I wrote in 1971 2 years
Wow.
before it was selected. And it tells the gory details of why this code is superior to anything. And so that's in there for all of the experts to read. Actually, if you go to the web, you'll find out that it says even in Wikipedia, one place there was a thing about IBM just came up with this idea at the last minute. But here, 2 years before, I had already published it, and
Right.
actually, I took that publication and presented it not to the Supermarket Institute because they weren't ready for it yet, but to the National Retail Merchants Association in Dallas, Texas, at their convention. So it's word for word what I presented, and
Wow.
it's quite a long appendix. Anyway, back at the ranch, we worked closely with the Supermarket Institutes. We had a laboratory test facility. I think every major supermarket chain at the time came and saw our test equipment after our announcement in '73. We couldn't show them the stuff before it was announced because we were, always being very careful not to do a restraint of trade or anything like that. IBM being, such a big company. So in 1974, we opened our first test store, and the first store was actually that was actually a commercial store, was an NCR installation in Troy, Ohio, not far from Dayton, where they, scanned items. We were scanning at the same time, but we were scanning in test stores, not in a real store. I mean, they were real stores, but I mean, it wasn't a commercial item that had been bought because it was still test equipment. And we were doing that in Steinway in Montreal, Quebec, and also in the Pathway store in New Jersey. Anyway, our first opening was in '74, but the code really didn't pick up until probably '77 or so. And at first you had to print the code in the store with a cheap, inexpensive printer, and that's where most of the barcodes or the codes that were selected in competition with us would have failed, because there are all kind of problems you have with inexpensive printers printing these codes. And if it failed in the first few years, it would have never kicked off and it would have never gotten up by the bootstraps. And such things as, all these previous codes, the bullseye code, so on and so forth, they A, took up a lot of space, but B, they if you have too much ink in the printer or not enough ink, you get an unreadable code. Whereas our code had a facility for reading just as well if it had too much ink or as little, because we measured from the start of the beginning of a bar to the start of the beginning of the next bar. And if both bars get bigger, both those left sides move to the left. And if they don't have enough ink, they move to the right and the errors cancel. Whereas other people were meeting the width of a bar, comparing it with the width of the next space. Bars get fatter, the spaces get narrower, the error multiplies.
So if you can, for the audience, high level, break down, I mean, this is the engineer in me asking, how does the barcode, I mean, people would just see, black lines with some spaces, different varying thicknesses, and it's magic. Like, how does this represent a number, right? If you can just kind of break down, how does that work?
Yeah, sure. So basically 2 bars and 2 spaces represent a number. And you have numbers on the left-hand side and numbers on the right-hand side. And McKinsey wisely concluded that, what we needed was 5 on each side, 5 for the manufacturer on one side, the left, and 5 on the right for the item itself. And then so those 2 bars, so you might see a real fat bar and then a skinny bar, and then of course the spaces accordingly in between them. So that's enough information and a little more to pick a number. So you get a digit. You don't get alphanumerics because you don't have enough variables.
So it's basically a binary that's being converted into a.
That's right.
Okay,
exactly. Exactly. And as I said, we measure the leading edge of a bar to the leading edge of the next bar, the trailing edge of a bar to the trailing edge of the next bar. Very, very unique. Nobody else did that. And so it eliminates these things about bars too fat, bars too skinny, and blurs on the end of bars, because these in-store printers had to print fast and very cheap. And so you're moving the paper while you're bringing a stamp down on it, and you get blur at the, we can put the blur at the tip of the bar, nobody cares. Whereas if you have a bullseye or a circle, you can't tell where the blur is going to be, and you
Right.
get a misread.
That's
Wow.
amazing. All right.
So Paul, what exactly, because there's a lot of pieces, right, that make the barcode workable, from the barcode itself to the scanner, printers, once that code is read, connecting to a computer to understand what product it is, et cetera. What all did IBM provide across that whole sort of ecosystem?
Gary, that's like the best question I've been asked in quite a few podcasts. And it shows you really have a good feeling for this thing. Almost nobody realizes it, but everything else besides the code was as big and as important as the code. And if we didn't have that and have it economically, we would have never started scanning. And you kind of nailed it there. It starts out with the scanner. And what had happened just before this time frame was the helium neon laser was invented, and we were able to get it in 0.5 milliwatt form. And so we were able to come out with a bright light source. And I have worked with lasers in that research I told you that I had done before, so I was very familiar with that. And I had worked on scanning, the dots on the head of a pin, as James Bond and Q might have done. I did that for the CIA, so I knew how to get the best resolution and everything with the laser light and so on. So that was a real fantastic thing that came available. And by the way, there's another story in the book that's very interesting. Is the lawyers in IBM heard we were going to put a laser in the machine. And somebody even introduced legislation into the United States Congress, or had a proposal that they were going to, because they said the government is using lasers to shoot airplanes out of the sky, and we can't put them in the regular supermarket. But a 0.5 milliwatt, is
Right.
a fraction of nothing of a 60-watt light bulb that's already in the supermarket.
Right.
So anyway, I had to go buy rhesus monkeys from Africa and send them to Stanford Research Institute to do basic study on the accumulation problems of laser light in the human eye,
Oh
which
my
was
God.
equivalent to a rhesus monkey.
Yeah.
There's a lot of funny stories in there about that. It's called monkey business. Anyway, so, but then the next thing was the communications, Gary, and the communications is really very necessary, because we could have as many as 10, 12 check stands in the United States, but 40 in Europe in cash and carry stores of the time. They were kind of like pre-Costco's. And so you got up to 40 people pulling an item across a scanner. And before time enough passes that the person notices it takes any time for the price to come up on the display, we've got to send that along with maybe 39 other scans back to a back room, look the number up, because the number's the same for all stores.
Right.
Look the number up and change the inventory, and look up the price and whatever descriptor the supermarket wants to write out on the check slip, and then send that back to the printer to print and the display to display, while it's incremented the inventory, and if necessary ordered something else from inventory. So that took a communication system that we didn't have, and we wanted that communication system to work over existing store wiring, so they didn't have to rewire the whole store. That meant plain telephone lines, because they did have telephones between the check stands and the back room. And we did that through a communication system that these 6 guys, 2 of them were communications engineers, came up with. And by the way, a decade and a half later, I came back to Raleigh, and Ethernet had just been announced. And I was told by the IBM president, fix this quick, we don't have an Ethernet. And I came up with a thing called Token Ring. and
Oh, wow.
we did invent the token ring, and this was the supermarket.
Of
We called
course.
it Store Loop, Sloop, SLOOP, Store
Oh
Loop.
my God. So you were part of the token
Became the
ring
token
team?
ring. So, and I did that
Wow.
too. Yeah. So
Wow.
anyway, uh, and then the other thing I wanted to mention, Gary, and final answer your question, there's more, but the next most important one is the magnetic storage. We didn't have magnetic storage that would do the problem. We had to look the items up really quick, all these different
Yep.
items from 40 different
Right.
scanners. And then we had to have a big enough volume to hold the whole inventory and all that kind of stuff. So we needed both fixed and movable heads on a magnetic media. That had never been done before. And so we did that. We put in what was contact recording. It was really a Bernoulli effect, and not really contact, but we called it that. And it was the first use of the Winchester technology that went on floppy disks.
Yeah.
And so the magnetics was very unique in itself. So all of those things is where IBM came in, and I was able to, hire people from within IBM and a few from outside that had expertise in these areas. And I had touched in most of these areas in my previous workings. And so I got IBM labs around the world to, like the one in England, did the magnetic thing. We did the communications thing ourselves, and Endicott did the printer things. So
So
we were
Paul, this
working
is
with 3 continents and many labs
wow.
to get all this done.
Wow.
So this is amazing. I mean, you look at a simple barcode and you see, black stripes, and you don't realize how much had to go to make that actually real and usable in the world.
Yeah.
And so, Paul, are you saying barcodes first went into supermarkets on products sold in supermarkets? When did it kind of go explode into pretty much all of retail? Was it around the same time, or was
I
it a
think it was in the
gradual?
80s. No, I think it was in the 80s. It
Yeah.
was so we started on it in 69. It's standard selected in 73, first installation 74. I think at the end of 74, we only had 5 supermarkets installed.
Wow.
And so 75, 76, 77. And then, the supermarkets would come to us and have us write firmware, which went in read-only storage, which was used at the time because it was faster than you could get random storage. Now it's not a problem. And so by the time anybody got all of their chains installed and everybody was getting marking from the manufacturers, it was at the end of the 70s. And so by the time you got real volume installed, it was the early 80s. By the
Yeah.
early 80s, IBM went from 0% of the market to, I think in major supermarkets, which was a certain definition, we were at like 80%. We
Yeah.
went from 0 to 80%. And I think NCR, unfortunately for them, went from 95% to single digits.
Yeah. Because Shekar, remember what had to be happening in parallel here was it was really a chicken and egg problem, right? While the technology had been developed to do this with all the benefits that accrue to the retailer, the other side of the equation was getting all the brand manufacturers to print that barcode on their products.
Exactly.
Because
That's right. And that's what I'm saying. That had to happen before it could be really ubiquitous. And that happened in the very late 70s.
Yep. Yeah, as I think I'm remembering back, we installed scanning in our stores. It was sometime around 80, early 80s.
Yeah, that's right. That's what I say. You got the volume. So you got a significant percentage. I don't remember the percents, but I'm going to guess 3/4 of what they're doing now, 2/3 of what, 2/3 of the major companies had it done in the late 70s. But then people have got to order and install all these supermarkets, and it's not instantaneous. So by the time you had the volume installations, I think it was the early 80s.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the other important thing to call out here for our listeners is the implications of this technology, right? If you back up and stop to think about it, Shekar, in retail, before the invention and use of the barcode, as a retailer, we did not have individual SKU level data. right? When that product came across that checkout counter, it was, 59 cents, grocery, or, 59 cents frozen food. We didn't know what the item was. We knew what department or category it went to, but that was it, right?
Well, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. And we didn't talk about it yet, but the biggest problem was social problems and legal problems with the installation of the code. So,
Yep.
for example, in a first store installation, I sent my best engineer. He was one of the guys that came up with the store loop that later became the token ring. And I sent him up. Alex Soshenko was his name, and he went up to our first store, which was Giant Store in Tyson's Corner, Virginia. And I told him, call me first thing if tell me that it went great, or hopefully you're not going to tell me there's a problem. So he calls first thing as the store is supposed to open. And everything, I even had duplicated controllers. We didn't talk about that. That's another thing. We put duplicated controllers in because when you're taking the price off the item, what are you going to do? And so anyway, he calls me, hey, Paul, he says, I'm sorry, but the store couldn't open. What are you talking about? I mean, we checked everything 16 ways from Sunday. He said, yeah, it's not the technology. There's a picket line outside the store. Nobody's allowed can get to the front door.
Wow.
And labor unions had picketed the store because of price removal. And they were worried they were going to have all this scanning and lose check stand operator positions and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
And then, that problem fizzed and went away after a couple of days. The store opened. But in the course of the next few months, 18 states passed laws against operating a store without price marking. Or actually, most of the laws said if you put a scanner in the store, then you had to do price marking because they didn't want to bother stores that weren't doing anything different. And for example, California was one of those. And in California, they did have the foresight to write the law so that if nobody complained and after 1 year, it would just die. It would go away. So, and it did. But I went to other states like Montana and everything to deal with that question of what are you going to do about the prices? And in answer to the point you raised is even before that, I went to our test store in Montreal, Quebec, and a little old lady had just finished shopping and was walking out of the store. And it happened that I met there with an executive from the Canadian government who was dealing with this question that we'd been dealing with in the United States of, well, what does it mean to the consumer to have the prices off the merchandise? And the point you brought up, Gary, about itemized understanding of what individual item you're selling. So anyway, he stops this old lady and he says, are you upset that the prices are not on the merchandise? Does that bother your shopping? And she says, oh, no, sir. She says, it's actually fantastic because, and I was standing right there listening to this. She says, look at my slip here. So she pulls out the check register and it shows, instead of, like you say, grocery or just blank and 59 cents, 37 cents, 42 cents, and nobody can keep track of which is what that they bought. And now it says, Wheaties, large size, with almonds, 37 cents. And she says, look at this. Now what I do every time I shop, I go down to the next supermarket and I can see how much that item cost here and how much it cost there. And I know which one to buy. I can do price shopping. And I never could do that before. And, we never heard another hint of any problem with the Canadian government. And the guy was kind of set back in his tracks by this little old lady. And so, but yes, now we have all of that.
That is great.
And by the way, we did a magnetic code. It's the same code, but it's in magnetic media instead of black and white for the National Retail Merchants Association and all of the stores, that belong to them. And remember, at this time, the big three stores in the country were Sears, Penny's, and Ward's. Montgomery Ward, and
Right.
so they didn't know whether to use barcode printed or the magnetic code, but it was the same code. We had the same readers, the same logic, and everything, and so that was a big factor as well.
So is the mag stripe on credit cards also kind of using the same logic, or?
It uses slightly different logic and a slightly different encoding. I was a part of the team that did that for the first time, and we
Geez.
also built the magnetic stripe for the Bay Area Rapid Transit BART, and that was slightly different as well. But we had learned how to do that, and we didn't need these corrections. The supermarket code is corrected. Actually, if one of the numbers, the bars associated with a number are completely blurred, it will correct that. It can read the other 9 and figure out, okay, if those 9 were this, then the 10th one had to be that, and it'll
Oh,
correct it.
wow.
And it will, if there's 2 errors, it can't correct it, but it
Right.
will notify you that it made a mistake. And so it has all of that built into it as well. But the social issues were very, very large, and they did hold back to some degree the the amount of time it took to get
There's
it.
an interesting story I want to kind of add in here, Paul. And I'm sure you're aware of this, but back in, I think, the 13th century, when Venice was kind of like the center of the world for trading and merchants, the Italians brought back the concept of universal time from China, because there was no universal time. Like, people didn't know what 9 o'clock meant, right?
Yeah,
Because
right.
people didn't have watches and clocks. You could just tell people, let's meet at the Times Square at noon, when at high noon, right? And you look at the position of the sun. There was no way to coordinate. And what really happened is, in 13th century Venice, when this concept of this water clock from China came back and they converted that into this tower clock in the center of the city, you could now have merchants that agreed to meet at 11 a.m. at the port. And so trade exploded, because now you could actually coordinate meetings between people at a time that you can agree on. And it's interesting because the barcode is simple, but it enables and facilitates trade and tracking transactions in business at a level that's scalable, and like it's amazing. And I think most people don't realize how fundamental it is to today's commerce.
Oh yeah. The
Yeah.
car, I mean, everything in the car and the whole assembly line and everything. They scan items, and think of Amazon. I mean,
Yeah.
when you just buy something, where does it go? What box does it go into? What line does it go down? All the automation. You can really do immense automation with the
And so
barcodes
what
to
we have
guide things.
today, we of course have different types of barcodes, right? You have the QR code and you have the
Yeah, right.
GS1 code, and you have different barcode standards, UPC-A versus whatever 128, or they have different, but essentially they're using the same methodology. It's just different means of encoding. Is that right?
Well, the bars themselves, when you see the bars, as far as I know, they're all even the same encoding that we came up with. I think
Oh,
that's
wow.
all our code. However, the QR code is different because you use an area. So now, obviously, with the technology that we have, instead of just scanning in one dimension, they can scan in two. I mean, it's a piece of cake. I mean,
Right.
it's just an extension of the same technology. So I'm a big proponent and of the QR codes, and there'll be more codes. But I don't think that the barcode is going to go away because it's so simple and it's so
Yeah.
ubiquitous and it's so used by everybody, and it does have a lot of flexibility. As you say, it's easy to add more digits on it. Then you've got your GS thing, and we did set up a Universal Product Code Council organization in Washington back in the 70s. At the time we came up with this, McKinsey had that idea, and we supported it, and so on and so forth, and the ad hoc committee, and so that has now grown into the GS1 and all
Right.
that stuff.
Right.
And
Right.
so we did allow for a buried code for country code to be buried in the leading digits of the bars and so on, and we allowed for that kind of change to be made. And
Like I think the USA is 00, right? It's
I can't remember the
something
numbers,
like
but
that.
probably, yeah.
Yeah, probably. Yeah.
But so we saw that coming, and we allowed it. We in the original book that we put out, it tells you here's how you can modify the code to extend the character set and so on and so forth.
Wow.
That is
Paul, I've got to buy your book. So I've got it
Yeah.
right here on Amazon. As soon as we're done, I will click the pre-order button.
Absolutely.
Okay.
No, this is fantastic. This is a very unique episode, Gary. I mean, we've never had one like this.
Yes.
And each time we go into this and record this, Paul, we're like, we've never spoken to somebody like this. And there's just so many amazing, unique individuals in the world out there. So it was a fantastic experience speaking to you and hearing your stories. I think, Gary, it looks like we're gonna have to get another episode of Paul in just to make sure we can get the full breadth and color of what he's
because there's I think a lot more to this, but
yeah.
Paul, this has been fascinating. I mean, I grew up in grocery retail, literally, and saw this from that side, but familiar with a lot of what you're talking about here, but just fascinating to hear your stories here, sort of on the other side.
Yeah. By the way, Paul, if you do send us your mailing address, we're gonna mail you one of these Retail Perch mugs so you can sip your morning coffee in it.
Okay,
We'd
that's
love for you to
great.
have
Well,
that.
do I have your email address? I
Well,
probably
we'll
do.
have somebody contact you and get your mailing
Okay.
address. Don't worry about
Okay,
that.
great.
We'll take
That'd
care of
be
that.
great.
But yeah, this has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for joining us here today. And sorry about those initial hiccups, but this should be coming out shortly, and we'll make sure you're notified of it, and you
Okay,
can
that sounds great.
share with your friends as well. Yeah.
I enjoyed it as well.
Yeah, and folks, I hope you had a great time. And if you'd like us to bring on more guests like Paul, although I'm highly doubtful that we'll ever find anybody like Paul, do let us know. But this is just been a huge education for me as well. So thank you again, Paul, and you have a wonderful day. And thanks for joining us, Gary. Anything else?
No, Paul, thank you very much. Really enjoyed talking with you.
Super.
Yeah, I enjoyed talking with both of you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Make sure to join us every Monday and connect with us at the Retail Perch on Instagram and Facebook.
And if you have any questions, feel free to email us at theretailperch@birdseye.com.
Until next time, this is Shekar.
And this is Gary, signing off.